Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this interview with the esteemed Julie Dirksen, best known to many of us as the writer of Design for How People Learn. This conversation is about her forthcoming book and specifically how it can help instructional designers who are working in domains like higher education. So, first of all, Julie, thanks so much for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule. It's always nice to talk to a celebrity. Um, But so I'm just gonna lead right into discussion of the new book. Its title, and what was the impetus behind? What made you decide this was going to be your next book?
Yeah, so the title is Talk to the Elephant: Design Learning for Behavior Change. And the sort of origins of the book I track back to, I want to say it was the early to mid 2000s, so maybe like 2004, 2005. I wound up working on a project through the University of Minnesota's School of Epidemiology. They were looking at online interventions around basically targeting AIDS and HIV prevention. And it was a really interesting project to be involved in because by like 2005, I think everybody was aware that condom usage would help with preventing, HIV infection and, some of those kinds of things. So it wasn't fundamentally a knowledge problem. Like it wasn't that people didn't know kind of the basics about what they should do to prevent the spread of HIV. And it was, that was after some of the initial stuff had happened, but it was definitely before kind of our current state where, the medications have advanced quite a lot and all of those kinds of things. So it was one of these things where I'm like, kind of looking at my instructional design toolbox. And my instructional design toolbox has great tools for helping people remember things or developing skills or, providing performance support solutions is certainly something that I kind of felt like I had in my toolbox. But this kind of like people know what to do, but they still aren't doing it. People know that they should, do these kinds of behaviors, but they still weren't happening. And, the good part about that particular project is that the researchers had a fairly, well-developed model around kind of helping people in interventions and things like that, because they had been doing these as kind of in-person workshops, but they were really looking at kind of how do we move this to an online environment. And obviously the technology landscape in 2005 was really different too. But how do we, they were particularly looking at the question of, hey, there's lots of people who don't necessarily live in cities or don't necessarily have access to the kinds of resources, because they would do these in-person workshops and they had really good success rates out of the in-person workshops and they were getting really positive feedback from those, but they were looking at the question of kind of how do we put this online. And it was a really interesting question, because it turned out that like some of the factors that really influenced it were things that kind of weren't obviously part of like just telling people louder and more emphatically that they should, practice safe sex practices. It was things like, well, if your mental health is good, you're more likely to take action to protect yourself. If your physical health is good, that can impact things. If you are comfortable negotiating condom usage with a partner, you're more likely to do it, So there were a whole bunch of factors that kind of came into play about whether this behavior happened or not that weren't, again, information based. They weren't just tell people louder and more emphatically that they should do this. And then, a few years later, I was working with a group based out of DC that was looking at a lot of health related things. So, the questions of exercise and diet and all of these kinds of things. And they were a startup company that was looking at a technology solution. We were a little ahead of smartphones at that point. So I really think they would have been a natural fit for some of the smartphone apps if they had if that had happened a few years later. But I learned about the rider and the elephant, which is this idea that you've got kind of a dual decision making thing. And a lot of the models for these things have this idea of a dual decision maker, right? So the idea behind an elephant is, like if you think about your brain, you've got things like down by your spinal cord, like breathing and heart rate and reflexes, and you get visual cortex, and you get auditory, and you get fine motor control and gross motor control, and you get sensory and perception. And right in the middle of your brain, you get the limbic system, which is a lot of emotional regulation and fight or flight and all of those kinds of things. So a big portion of your brain is concerned with like physical sensations, controlling your body and the environment, emotional reactions, all of this kind of stuff that's not this kind of logic rational model. And then up front, we get the prefrontal cortex, which is considered to be the area most engaged with things like impulse control and planning for the future and logic and reasoning. And so this model, which comes from psychologist Jonathan Haidt, although there's a few versions of it floating out there, is the idea that like there's a big elephant, which is your visceral, physical, feeling, sensory, part of your brain is an elephant. And sitting on top of your elephant is a little rider, which is your logical, rational, plan for the future, project out, consider consequences, control impulse part of your brain. So you've got a little elephant or a little rider sitting on top of a big elephant. And one of the things that happened, and one of the things that I found in the HIV example, was that my tool set was very focused on how do we help the rider remember things, or how do we present a logical argument, or any of those kinds of things, and very little about like how do we put this into an emotional context, how do we help people kind of get over the barriers of doing a thing or an action, or any of those kinds of things. And that when we just talk to the rider, like compliance training is my favorite example. It's 100% rider, right? But the issue is, I think we viewed like emotional context or soft skills or anything, we all kind of view this as a nice to have. But one of the things about that is your feelings about something tell you how important it is. So there's I realize I'm going all over the place here, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. There's a researcher, Antonio Damasio, who has looked at people who have had damage to the emotional areas of their brain, either strokes or accidents or things like that. And one of the things he specifically looked at is, does this make you a better decision maker? Because that's the argument, right? That we should be rational decision makers and we should follow the logic and all this kind of stuff. And so he was like, if the brain does not have very much emotional impact, and these are people who, they don't report feeling really happy or really sad or whatever, they kind of have a sort of flat emotional affect because of this damage that they've had, even though they're they'll score normally on an intelligence test and all sorts of things like that. And so the question that he was looking at is, if we do take messy emotion out of the equation, does that make you a better decision maker? And the answer is really, it doesn't. Like, decision making is incredibly hard without that kind of emotional tug to tell you, oh, this is important, or this is crucial, or I feel bad about this. Why do I feel bad about it? And sometimes those clues need to lead you to looking at the logic of it or something like that. But really, these systems are intertwined in all of our decision making. And right now, we are living in a world that is just so chock full of information, we can barely stand it, right? And you need something that says, this is what I should pay attention to. And the factors around what I should pay attention to are really reliant on that feeling. Like, you need to have the feeling that it's important, or the emotional context of interest or curiosity or any of those kinds of emotions. And so this is a very long-winded explanation for where the title of the book comes from. One of the things that happens in a lot of academic or business environments or whatever is we're going to talk to the writer. We're going to tell you exactly why you should do this. We're going to spell it out in an SOP. We're going to make, give you the academic paper, whatever. But without this emotional context, it's super difficult to allocate attention to something if it just doesn't feel important, right? And so so that's what
I do a lot of compliance training as a director of professional development. So you're hitting right at my world here right now. Like, yes, they wanted it, but it's something in them says, really,
Yeah. So that's where the title "Talk to the Elephant" comes from. Is that I think our toolbox for addressing the elephant. And I want to be really clear, like the problem with this sort of human animal metaphor is it makes the elephant seem like it's kind of dumb. And the elephant is absolutely not dumb. Like it is not the foolish, irrational creature. It has a very important purpose in all of our decision making. But we've decided that we're going to prioritize talking to the quote unquote rational actor, the rider in this system, and not expend effort kind of also engaging the elephant. And, here's the thing, like if your rider and your elephant agree, like if I come home after work and I go, oh, I really need to weed the garden, and I like weeding the garden because it's my relaxing activity, then your rider's like, we need to do that. And the elephant's like, yeah, that sounds great. You're going to do the behavior, and we don't have an issue with behavior change. But when we have a system where we're relying entirely on the rider essentially dragging the elephant along, then we're making everything more difficult for everybody involved, basically. So that's what that was the thing that originally got me interested in it. And when things like the Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein book Nudge came out, and we started to have a popularization of behavioral economics, and really, I think, an awareness of behavioral science started to really come up, I got very interested in those and started looking at what are the models, what are the frameworks that can help us in that whole space, and then bringing that more into instructional design, because I do think our tool set in instructional design focuses really heavily on the cognitive and not on some of these other factors, and that we're creating a learning experience that relies 100% on somebody's rider, which is essentially relying them to force themselves to stay in that space, even if there's a bunch of cues telling them there's other things you'd rather be doing. Because we've all got like 37 other things all the time, right? Like there's, we have to choose. You're choosing right now to listen to this interview, and hopefully it's useful and engaging. But it's also one of these things where, like, people are probably multitasking as they listen to this, or people are catching a little bit but then kind of clicking off because they got to go do other things or whatever. And so the world that we live in, where you're constantly jockeying for attention and hoping to be somebody's priority at any given moment, means that we need to really design for that carefully and not just hope it happens by accident.
So you made a pretty good argument for the fact that instructional designers really need to start paying attention to research and behavioral design. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure many of them are. In our last conversation, we talked about the rise of people who are specifically behavioral designers. That's an interesting new field. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I do think it came out of the sort of push of behavioral economics in like the late 2000s, early teens and stuff like that. Some of the governments got very interested in some of this. So you have the Behavioral Insights Group in the UK, and there was something similar in the Obama administration. And so you had them looking at it at the policy level, because of course, any of these things exist within complex systems. So any particular behavior is going to exist within a complex system. So whether or not your students finish their homework, or whether or not people read the syllabus or anything like that, like it seems like it's like, do they read the syllabus? That's a really simple behavior that is constant struggle in higher ed. But I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who was describing all of the disclaimer stuff that she always had to put in her syllabi that was required by the university. Well, like it's the exact same in every syllabus. Like they're just copying and pasting a bunch of policy rhetoric into it. You stick it right in the middle of the syllabus, and it's kind of a cue to students that they don't need to read it, right? And so there are important things that maybe the professor really wants to communicate in a syllabus, but if it's surrounded by a bunch of stuff that they've seen a million times before and don't really care about at this point, like their policy for negotiating, disputing a grade, they'll care about that when they actually have that problem, but they don't care about it at the beginning of the semester. And so, or the, reporting, or privacy or whatever these things are. One of the biggest issues in all kind of difficult behavior change problems is sort of delayed or absent feedback. That's a really consistent issue that shows up. I would say I've never seen like an actual behavior change problem that didn't have delayed or absent feedback as part of it. So if we ask ourselves, we give these students the syllabus at the beginning of the semester, and we say, how important is it that they read all this sort of policy verbiage that we've put into the syllabus? And the answer is kind of like, not at all, right? Like there's no consequence. The professor didn't care about it. They're just putting it in there because the university is telling them that they need to do it for, legal reasons. The student doesn't care about this, and they won't care about it unless something comes up that requires them to actually need something from that's in there. And the professor is frustrated because the students also didn't read the part about where they turn in homework. And so the first time they do an assignment, they get 9 million questions about where are they supposed to turn in their homework. So like the parts that were actually relevant kind of get buried, but like nothing bad happens to anybody if they don't do the thing. And so they're not going to do the thing. And not that it always has to be a bad consequence, but I mean, it's a situation where probably people aren't seeing any benefit to it as well, and everything about the format and everything about the language says, you don't really need to pay attention to this. This is just noise that we're going to put in here because we have to, but there's no downside to you skipping over this, and I know that this is, I mean, I know I haven't done a syllabus probably in 15 years, but I used to teach undergraduates, and you sort of just plan for a certain amount of, they're not going to read it. I'll just have to explain it when the time comes, and I accept that. And
I used to have a quiz. And I used to have a form which says I read, I understood everything, and I agree to the terms. So later on, if they had any issues or they say they've forgotten, I pull it out and say, according to this, you said you read and understood everything, So if there are any issues, so yeah, I would have these elaborate measures put in place to say, okay,
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, that's a better answer than nothing. Like that actually gives them some reason to go and look at it and pay attention, especially if the quiz items focused on the actual parts of the syllabus you cared about them processing and things like that. So so it's one of these things where like they should care because this is their education and this is their how well they do in this class is going to be related to whether or not they parse some of this information in the syllabus. And presumably they want to do well in the class, and presumably they want to do well in the class, both because they want the grade, but also because this is something that they're spending time and effort on learning, and they want to learn it well and all this kind of stuff. So it's but to the original point that I was making, this all exists within a system, right? There's a whole bunch of variables that are going to influence whether or not these students read the syllabus. The university's legal department, the structure of the technology within the university, just this kind of expectation norm that a syllabus is like a multi-page Word document that maybe we'll PDF or something like that and hand out to students. I mean, what if we put all the crucial syllabus information in a presentation, in a PowerPoint presentation, and you could just click through the slides and it would tell you the really crucial things that you needed to do? Would that promote uptick? It might. Honestly, this is not, like I said, it's been a while since I had to do this. I haven't experimented with it all, but like, are there formats?
It hasn't changed that for most people. It hasn't changed that much. There are a few innovators with syllabus design, but for the most part, I'd say 90% what you remember.
Yeah. And I mean, on the part of the faculty too, like this isn't the part about the course that they care the most either. They want to communicate their passion about their subject matter to their students. They probably care deeply about that. The like grading rubric is something that, again, they don't even, at the beginning of the semester, the professors don't even really care that much about that. They're like, yeah, I need to spell it out. If I don't spell it out, I'm going to get arguments from my students and da 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 da. I'm gonna do this, in an official way so that I'm avoiding trouble in the future, but I'm not like, do I care deeply about my grading rubric at the beginning of the semester? So it's very rider and not very elephant. And these are common characteristics of places where we see these behavior change issues. I think I managed to utterly avoid the question though, so I'll come back to that. The rise of behavioral design, like I said, I think really the behavioral economics came up, but then there were people in a number of other disciplines, so things like public health, psychology, user experience, where a bunch of people were like, hey, we're doing stuff about this too. It's not just, it's not just the the behavioral economists. And so we started to see, and I think probably in the last 4 or 5 years in particular, we've started to really see people talking about being behavioral designers. So companies are hiring behavioral designers. Honestly, we just went through the biggest behavior change experiment in the history of the world. And there was an enormous amount of behavioral science that was being applied, sometimes effectively, sometimes not effectively, around the pandemic. But the news and everybody tended to focus on the failures of it. But if you think about the amount of behavior that changed, in 2020 around the pandemic, it was extraordinary. Like, there has not been a coordinated effort on the part of that many people ever, because that is literally the biggest number of people that were ever kind of coordinating their efforts around certain key behaviors, whether it was mask wearing or vaccinations or any of those kinds of social distancing, any of those kinds of things. That was the biggest behavior change initiative, and remarkably successful in a lot of ways. A lot of people changed a lot of behaviors during that time period. Now, granted, our understanding of what the behaviors needed to be definitely adapted as we moved through the pandemic. And so there was some stuff that we were doing early on that we realized we didn't need to do later, and all of that kind of stuff. I don't want to get into any kind of judgments around any of that, but just from a pure point of view of like, how do we help people change behaviors? And there was definitely publications that came out from some of the different public health entities where everybody looked at that and they're like, are you kidding me? This is so complicated. And that, really refining the messaging to be as effective as possible was something a lot of people were working on. And a lot of those people are either essentially doing what a behavioral designer would do or actively identifying as behavioral designer. The World Health Organization has added kind of a behavioral design component. We're starting to see organizations with chief behavioral officers. It's definitely been a dominant in certain fields: public health, healthcare, safety, finance has had a big component of it, where I think there's some real understanding of the necessity for behavioral design in some of those kinds of fields. And so those are some of the domains that are leading the way. But we're seeing it in a lot of different places. We're seeing professional organizations kind of grow up around it. We're seeing podcasts about behavioral design, just as a get started place if people are interested. Behavioralscientist.org is very good, and that's a kind of an online publication for it. Samuel Salzer started a thing called Habit Weekly, and that's good. And there's other ones. I'm happy to kind of put together a list of a few of the different sources that I think are particularly good on it. So
that would be great. One of the things we talked about was designing for the frustration of learners in low autonomy learning environments.
Mm-hmm.
And how we can design around that. You had some thoughts. Can you share some of that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that a lot of times we're dealing with is we're trying to remove error from the system. And one of the main tools that we usually have for removing error from the system is a high compliance or high regulated environment, right? And sometimes if you don't remove error from the system, people die. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, or you're a if you're if you're an airline, people like people can die if we do not have, if people don't follow the rules, if people don't, kind of meet these things. But we also have this issue, and within universities, we're trying to, move so much through, right? We're dealing with the bureaucracies, and we're trying to, we're dealing with the education of so many people, and it's a complex topic at every level, from the weekly assignment all the way up to how do I get my transcript, to how do I, meet all the requirements, to who's advising me, to all of these kinds of things. There's a lot of moving parts, and we build up bureaucracies around those moving parts. But the challenge then becomes, the more control we apply to an environment, the less space for autonomy that we create, right? And so I hear this desire for self-directed learners all the time, and I know I had it when I was teaching undergraduates. I'm sure it's still a constant thing where you would just like students to take some initiative. And maybe that initiative is to go read the dang syllabus where I explained all of this stuff, instead of sending me 37 emails about, I can't figure out how to submit the online quiz, like, the initiative is, I want you to kind of take some control of your own education. The initiative is, I want you to be interested in the readings and really actively looking for the, the important things to pull out of it, versus try to figure out how little I can read to pass the course, things like that. And whenever we get into that, whenever we get into kind of creating opportunities for autonomy, opportunities for students to have some control over their own environments, because a lot of times, and I've been in those classes too, you go into class and you don't feel like you have any control, right? And in particular, some of our assessment systems have been very, very not great about that, right? The one where you like have a midterm and a final, and if you screw those up, you're just done, and you get the grade that you get. Like, that is a very high control environment where students absolutely feel like they don't have, I mean, obviously they can control things like how well they study for the test, but if you studied really hard and you just studied the wrong things, and you find yourself in the final, like, you can't course correct at that point. There's a great video I should send you. It's talking about Extra Credits is a whole video series around game design. It's on YouTube. It's a fantastic series on game design, and it's really wonderful. But they did a couple on education, and they were talking about assessments where you get the grade and it's done, right? And I always had a policy with my students where they could revise and resubmit, right? We had time frames around it and stuff, because I didn't want stuff like weeks after the semester ended, but you could always, I was doing stuff like project management. So I'm like, I want you to have this skill set more than I want to, test you on, did you memorize the things or whatever it is. But we also know that there are definitely classes where that's not the case. And they were talking about, in games, we building failure into the process. So the need to kind of like jump and jump and jump and jump and jump until you finally figure out the right button mashing components to get to the thing and grab the, the mushroom and whatever, or kill the saber-tooth tiger or whatever it is. Nobody feels bad for failing in video games, like, because that is part of the process, and you're going to try it and try it and try it and try it until you get it right. Well, one time, one shot only assignments are the exact opposite of that, right? You can't learn from the assignment and then go back and fix it, and kind of continue to evolve your thinking. And so when students are in those environments where if you don't get it right the very first time, then you don't get it right, and there's not much you can do about it. Then that is going to create something where the message to the student is, it doesn't really matter what you do, and there's no point in trying. Like, if you don't succeed the first time, just give up, because there's nothing else to be done about it. And so when we look at autonomy in these environments, you want to ask questions about how important is control in this environment? How much do students actually have the ability to redress issues? And there's a difference between, and I've done both versions, so I know this. There's a difference between building redress into the system, like into the grading system for the whole class, versus just caving and being nice as a professor, right? Because I've done both of those things. Like I've been like, oh, it's fine. Okay, you can still hand it in. Like I've done that, and I did it. I used to do it a decent amount, and then I would learn to like build some of that stuff in the next go round, where the students still had some accountability and some responsibility, but there were ways that they could fix things. And that was better than me just being a soft touch about stuff for a whole bunch of reasons, right? So if I could build it into the structure of the assessments or the structure of the class or something like that, then I didn't have to like make exceptions or say, oh, it's okay, fine, I'll take care of, whatever. And then you don't resent it either, because it's just the way the class is set up, right? So there is, and now I'm going to have to think about this and maybe do some writing on it, but like literal design for autonomy in these systems. Catherine Lombardozzi did a research report for the Year Learning Guild on self-directed learners a while back that was pretty good. And one of the things that she particularly called out in that was also, do they have the ability to be a self-directed learner? So that might be, do they know how to go out and research stuff and find things and bring it back? Do they know how to evaluate what they're finding? Do they know how to evaluate their own work and make judgments about it so that they can critique it before it goes to the professor? And that those things we sort of assume students should know how to do, but they may or may not. And that's going to have a big impact on whether or not they have autonomy or they're able to be self-directed in any way. So there's a whole bunch of factors in that. And I think it's a really interesting area, but yeah, it's also a challenge.
It's one of my biggest complaints about our traditional model is that one of its hopefully unintended consequences is that it educates us into learned helplessness, passivity, the sitting around, the waiting for instructions, the raising the hand, the one shot, the grade is over, or the two shots. I mean, like you, when I taught, I would give students, I would take late work, and I would make it a thing. And other students would complain, says, I follow the rules and did work, and now you're giving them an extra help. You got caught up on all the things that you didn't think were important, and away from the things that you really thought were important. You wanted the students to focus on it in the time that you had them there. So yeah, thinking about autonomy and design, I think, is very important, because now more than ever we have to educate people out of that passivity which they've acquired from the traditional model of sit and wait for the instructions, and if you fail, then you fail. So move, So it's a challenge, but it's really important. So I think that the last question I'm going to ask you is given your forthcoming book, how do you think instructional designers working in higher education can best apply your ideas?
Yeah, part of it is one of the things about it is being deliberate about the behaviors that you want to see. So sometimes we sort of hand wave or assume we know what we want everybody to do, but when you actually kind of focus in, so if we say we want students to be more engaged, well, that's great, and it sounds like I just set a behavior, but I didn't really, right? That's a quality of their participation or something, but there are several behaviors that sit underneath that. So what do I want if I say I want my students to be more engaged? Do I want them to ask questions? Do I want them to dig into the topic on their own and bring their results back to class? Do I want them to help formulate their own strategies for operating in the class? Well, those are all things that, and there's dozens more besides, I'm sure, where it sits underneath, wanting your students to be more engaged. And when you start to get specific about those things, we can actually start to formulate strategies, right? If we leave our definition of what we want at we want students to be more engaged level, then you're going to get like general vague interventions. But if you go, I want students to ask questions in class, okay, now we've got something that's like specific. So can I create circumstances where students will ask questions in class. Well, yeah, I can make it an assignment, right? Like you need to bring certain questions to class. Now I do that and I find out that the students are bringing really perfunctory, not very interesting questions to class, right? Okay, so now I need to like take, I accomplished the goal of having students ask questions in class because I said you have to. But now I realize that like asking questions about this material may be a skill that my students do or don't have. So now I want to look at something like, how do I help them formulate questions around a thing, right? So Dan Meyer is a math teacher, and he specifically looked at this, right? Like he would bring in a piece of visual data, sort of. He would, like, one of his classic ones is he had a big plastic tub with measurements on the side and he stuck a hose in it and just filmed it filling up with water. And then he would have his math students say, okay, what questions could you ask about this? And a question might be like, when is it going to overflow? Or how much water is in the bin? Or how quickly is the rate of flow? Or, any, like, a whole series of things. But he would actually work on developing the skill of, like, he would actually have lots of examples where they would literally practice asking questions about it. Here we're filming a basketball game and here's somebody shooting for the basket. What questions did you ask about that? Like, you could ask how fast the basketball is going, or is it going to go in, or, what's the arc on it, or any set of things. But if the skill of interrogating a situation to ask questions was something that you want your students to be able to do, how do you help scaffold them through the process of developing that skill? And now we're in a whole different realm of looking at interventions than if we stayed at I want my students to be more engaged, right? If I can get into what's the actual specific behavior that I'm looking to happen, and I'm wanting them to learn math, but I'm also wanting them to learn methods of inquiry and ways of thinking about problems and some of those kinds of things. And those are skills. And my litmus question for something a skill is it reasonable to think somebody can be good at this without practice? And if the answer is no, they can't be good at this without practice, then I'm dealing with a skill. I should flip the negative and just say, do people need to practice to be good at it? Much easier question. But if they need practice, then it's a skill. Then you need to figure out how are they going to practice. And I do think that that's another area where the instructional design toolbox is not what it should be, which is really around practice design. And if I ever do another book, that's probably the topic I'm gonna write on. But it apparently takes me a while to cook a new book, so I'm not making any guarantees about when that one would be out. But that's the next area of interest for me. Really, is we're good at information-based things. We're good at cognitive-based things. I don't think we have the right toolbox around skill development. And so I've been looking at other domains where I feel like they have a more mature practice around skill development. So like video game designers know about skill development, and athletic coaches know about skill development, and music teachers know about skill development, and language instructors know about skill development. So what are some of the practices around the way they design their instruction that we can bring over into, project management, or biology, or whatever the thing might be. So
that's why I spend a lot of my time these days thinking about short sims, because I want to give people the opportunity to practice, and make choices. Yeah, I definitely think skill development is certainly the next frontier. It's excellent. So, well, thank you for answering all my questions.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Yeah, again, your book will be coming out in September.
Yeah, and so the short version of the book is that there are some good models around behavior change that are out there, and in particular, there's a model I like, the behavior change wheel, or the COM-B model, out of University College London Center for Behavior Change, and it's Susan Mickey and her colleagues there that have worked on this model. All models are wrong, but some of them are useful, is a quote that I take to heart. So I don't want to oversell it, but I do think it's a nice comprehensive model to use for kind of breaking down a problem. And it looks at, are they capable? Do they have the knowledge or the skills or, the things that we typically deal with in education? Do they have the opportunity? Does the social opportunity support it? Does the physical opportunity support it? And physical opportunity could be literally the environment they're in, but it could also be the LMS or the computer systems or the bureaucracy or whatever it is, right? And then motivation, do they have the reflective motivation? Is this a goal? Is this something they care about? Do they have the automatic motivation? Do they have the high habits or biases or kind of unconscious, leanings towards it? And so then you can use that model. And so the book focuses on that model, brings in stuff from other areas of behavioral science too, but it's really how do we think about that and apply it to an educational setting?
I'm going to end with one question that I know a colleague of mine is going to ask is,
okay,
will there be an audiobook version?
I'm talking to my publisher about that right now. She's kind of inclined to do it, so I think there's a good chance that we'll do an audiobook version. I have all of these visuals in the books, and so whenever you've got a book with a lot of visual material in it, it's a little bit more challenging to figure out because you can do a PDF with the audiobook, but mostly people are going to listen to it while they're walking the dog, not while they're sitting in front of a PDF. And so I think we do need to have a little bit of a conversation about how to navigate the visual components in the book. But there's at least a decent chance there's an audiobook version. No guarantees yet, but it's being talked about.
I would tell your publisher that since one of the core audiences is instructional designers, they're information geeks. They will go look at the PDF after walking in the door. So this cohort, you have a higher than average chance of actually getting them to look at the PDF.
Great.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Helpful data point. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's always fun to talk about this stuff, and thank you for letting me do kind of a nerdy deep dive on all of it. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all you do for the community, Peter. It's really great. So
thank you again.